Welcome to British International Investments Inside Events, where we share practical lessons on private sector development based on our experience, knowledge, and research. I'm Colin Buckley, and I will be your chair today. So today we focus on the role of digital transformation in economic development. The traditional sectors that development finance have focused on have been infrastructure, agriculture, and financial institutions. And that's largely remained the same over the past 50 years. But in the last 10 or 20 years, technology has risen in importance. And today we're joined by Nikunj Jinsi and by Abhinav Sinya to investigate what role technology plays in economic development and what role development finance should play in funding that technology. Now, as many of you know, our hour today will be split between interviews, a panel discussion, and then audience questions and answers. So if you have any questions during the course of the hour, then please ask them in the chat using the Q&A button that should be appearing on the bottom of your screen. So let me introduce Nikunj Jinsi. Nikunj is an investment committee member here at BII and also co-founder and managing partner of the Better Future Network. Nikunj has over 20 years of venture capital investment experience in developing markets, and he's currently a senior advisor to several European institutions around emerging market venture strategy. Prior to this, Nikunj spent 16 years at the IFC in Washington, where he was global head for venture capital and built a direct portfolio in leading technology companies that eventually grew to about $1 billion. Prior to joining IFC, Nikunj spent 9 years working in Asia, where he was based out of Singapore as managing director for Asia Tech Ventures, an Asian venture fund. So Nikunj, welcome.
So, thanks, Colin. Thanks for having me on.
So let's start with history, because 16 years in doing this at the IFC, you were right there at the beginning. So tell us the story of how sort of digital investment in low and middle income countries sort of grew in importance, especially at the IFC.
Yeah, I don't think, thanks, Colin. And I think that it's not necessarily germane to IFC, but generally how development happened in lower and middle income countries. If you look at digitalization, if you want to define it, some people think of it as something that is scary, like a meta universe, an alternative reality, which it is not. It really is, you're using data together with real world infrastructure to come to more efficient decision-making, more efficient solutions. And the way I describe digitalization in a nutshell is by trying to describe a digital stack. And what is a digital stack? It is much likened to, I guess, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So it starts with the physical infrastructure, such as telecommunications, data centers, fiber optic networks that actually transport the bits and the bytes. That's the basis of it. And BII in the past has successfully invested in that in places like Celtel and more recently Liquid Telecom. Then on top, I'd say that you'd find financial solutions and financial inclusion solutions that provide gateways for providing transactions and for paying for these transactions. And which is essential for any digital transaction. And so there too, we were involved at IFC in the early days, probably about 10, 12 years ago when fintech really started coming into play in emerging markets. But BII is coming on board as well now. So it's most recently invested into a play called TMAP in Nigeria, which focuses on providing essential financial services towards people in rural areas. And so you just got to imagine that, if you didn't have that, if digitization would have happened there, how likely would it be that banks would build out infrastructure and ATMs in rural parts of Nigeria? probably the answer is it would be very unlikely because it's just not economically viable. So, taking it further, then on top of that, you'd find like developing a layer of delivery networks, so last mile delivery networks and long haul delivery networks, which is important if you order packages online, which most of us would have done through Amazon and other e-commerce facilities. To expect that to happen in developing markets, it's a lot harder because the physical infrastructure, the roads are just not there. And so to develop that, it requires just local solutions. And then on top of that, you build out applications. But to your point, Colin, I think digitalization has been happening for the better part of 2 decades in emerging markets. People just haven't realized and appreciated it. What we're seeing now is the use of applications towards consumers, and that's where lower income markets and middle income markets are coming up the stream.
I mean, most of us, when we think about technology, I mean, a lot of us think of it in terms of iPhones and gaming, and of course, I mean, obviously, developing countries must have that as well. But development finance has usually been focused on traditional priorities like agriculture or building roads. I mean, sometimes we hear criticism that, is this really a development priority in our markets? Should we really be using development finance to focus on technology rather than, shareholder primary agriculture? So what's your response to that?
No, I think it's a good and valid question, Colin. And the response is it's actually both. You're not looking at investing in technology for technology's sake. You're not looking at Silicon Valley type of deep tech investments here. You're looking at applying technology to solve fundamentally critical underlying problems. So if you're looking at, for example, at providing good quality education in rural areas and remote learning and providing digital tools would be a way towards that. That's a much more efficient way of developing infrastructure than, let's say, going about it the traditional way where you need to build buildings, you got to train teachers. You still got to train teachers in this case, in the digital case, but it's slightly different. They need to know how to learn digital tools and utilize that, and also be able to monitor their classes remotely in ways that they haven't done before. So to me, it's almost like it is essential. It's not almost, it is essential to invest in digital plays in emerging markets, because many markets just don't have any other way to solve for it. I can't see retail operations, Selfridges anywhere, like open up stores in rural areas out in Sudan, South Sudan, or in Ethiopia. You'll have to find other solutions on it. And not more often than not, the solution is driven by the digitization of events. And again, here, what you're doing is you're using existing infrastructure and you are trying to utilize data and the fact that people are data savvy and having digital skills, and most notably having access to smartphones and mobile phones with cheap data to replicate for the fact that it's going to be too uneconomical to build out the actual infrastructure.
I mean, let's go with another common conception. I mean, there's a common conception that technology, can make people fiendishly rich. And if we look at the richest people in the world today, most of them are kind of tech billionaires, and famously, investors can be really rich. I mean, is that story fundamentally different in emerging markets? And back to this question about, is this a place that development finance has to focus on? No one's ever going to get rich on agriculture, but people are going to get rich on tech. So is there, why should taxpayer dollars be used there?
So I think it's a good question, and as you know, this is a broader question where income inequality gets discussed, and specifically the fact that tech billionaires in developed markets have gone wealthier over time in the pandemic when lots of other people were suffering. That's a broader question. I'm looking at the solutions, you mentioned ag, for example. There are tech examples for ag coming up, and tech-enabled examples for ag. Many of them, BII, for example, has already invested in several of them. Cropping being one, but there are many others in that. It may well be that look, the underlying premise is that these businesses all need to scale up. these businesses are privately owned, and some of the people who are involved in the private ownership will make money out of that. And in my mind, there's nothing wrong with it. I don't think it should be a goal of any founder to actually make billions of dollars in doing what they do, but make sure that there's a equalization of distribution of the benefits that they bring across the users as well as all shareholders. But at the end of the day, you're looking at businesses that are fundamentally privately owned, that require private market solutions, more or less, in addition to some cases, concessional finance and tax dollars. But the only way these businesses can stay sustainable is as they become privately owned, that the private sector continues to fund them, and effectively these businesses become profitable. That has happened. We've seen hundreds of these examples now happen in developing markets. And if, as a result, some of the founders end up making up insane amounts of money, that is, I'd say neither great nor bad. But in many cases, want to look at the model of distributing the wealth amongst that comes out of these businesses. So again, I don't think that investing in tech is different from investing in ag or in education or health services. It is one and the same, I'd say. You're using more efficient technologies to deploy and to allow to scale further. These businesses may end up being more efficient and more profitable as a result. And yes, some of the founders and some of the investors end up making money out of
that. And one topic we've been focusing on a lot when we talk at these events is mobilization and the new kind of demands on development finance, not only to invest their own capital, but also to interact in new ways with other sources of capital. And I wonder, is investing in technology any different for BII or IFC because there's a more sophisticated surrounding kind of investment world, or is it substantially the same?
So it is. Mobilization is important. It depends on how you define it. But by and large, and depending on what study you read, emerging markets need around $100 billion to $200 billion a year to get across the hump into developing a digital infrastructure. No DFI, no financial institution has that money on their own. So you'll always have to club funds together. What BII has done, and I've seen some of the other DFIs have done, is more often than not work alongside with the private sector and understand that what each brings to the table. So deals can be done, $100 million deals could be done where there are 4 or 5 separate investors in it. So you mobilize one another, but each bring their own values to the table. So DFIs, BII has a very long-term perspective, has other sources, products, financial products that they could invest later down the road, has a big portfolio that they could lean on. For example, if they invest into a fintech business, they have a lot of banks that they have access to and a lot of banks in the portfolio, which is unique in its own right. Whereas many of the other investors tend to be hands-on. They are more operator, founder focused. They tend to work with these companies on a day-to-day basis. So they offer the operational management skills on a daily basis. So one, I think it's important to mobilize and to make sure that one goes in alignment, at least financially, when one does deals. But it's also important to recognize and realize what each party brings to the table uniquely.
So you mentioned Silicon Valley, and I mean, Silicon Valley is a source of capital, but it's also been, much trumpeted as a place that incubates technology companies with great success. And a lot of developing countries have tried to duplicate Silicon Valley in their own economies. I mean, famously, Nigeria tried to set up a technology city. I think Kenya's taken a shot at this. I mean, what are your views about either the wisdom or the likelihood of success for governments kind of taking that type of approach to promote technology in their economies?
Yeah, so I think there are many elements of 50, 60 years of Silicon Valley investment that are important, that are transferable to what we're doing. But fundamentally, emerging market venture capital investments is a different product from what you see happening in Silicon Valley. And so what I mean by that is the Valley, typically people look at taking technology risk and developing widgets or gadgets or, consumer apps and enterprise apps that could disrupt and be massively disruptive, predominantly in developed markets. Many of those solutions don't apply to emerging markets. So while they are some of the initiatives that local governments in emerging markets have taken would be helpful towards creating more of an entrepreneurial, founder-driven environment. Replicating Silicon Valley would be a bad one. And there are governments that have done it in 2 goes and 3 goes and done it successfully. For example, the government of Singapore, which is not a developing market, but they have spent better part of the last 2 decades looking to develop a local ecosystem. And they've had a couple of tries at it, but the try they've had over the last 10, 12 years where they've developed an ecosystem support where they wanted to focus on developing a physical Silicon Valley, but they were more focused on bringing in the ecosystem virtually and in real time together, providing incentives towards venture capitalists to set up locally, as opposed to try and bring in Silicon Valley venture capitalists. That seems to have worked out well, such that Singapore now is a hub within Southeast Asia. Similarly, in Africa, what you're seeing happen, and what I applaud, is developing local solutions, local fund managers, not to bring in that Silicon Valley money first, but actually focus on local fund managers who have local knowledge, have more often than not have been founders, entrepreneurial in their own right. Look to develop also local solutions at all levels, not just later stage VC, but also early stage incubators. Many businesses in Africa and South Asia still believe that if they're modestly successful, they should be going out to the Valley to Y Combinator to get that stamp of approval, which is the case. But I'm actually more keen to see that the road towards success in technology businesses doesn't have to start or go through Silicon Valley, but be local. And so it's incumbent on DFI such as BII to develop those local solutions and help set up those local accelerators, work with governments to provide the due incentives, and a lot more work to be done on that side. So to your point, no, you don't want to set up a Silicon Valley in these markets. You want to develop ecosystems that is germane and specific for each market. And by the way, an ecosystem in Pakistan will look completely different from an ecosystem in Lagos in Nigeria, would be completely different from what's happening in Nairobi in Kenya. So different flavors all over the place.
All right, thanks, Nikunj. I think, why don't we bring in Abhinav now, if we can. Let me introduce Abhinav Sinha, is the Managing Director and Head of Technology and Telecoms here at BII. He leads our technology and telecoms team. And since joining BII in 2018, he's been responsible for some of BII's most significant investments. These have included Liquid Telecom, the largest independent fiber and cloud service provider in Africa, the mobile partnership with Vodacom in Ethiopia, and setting up Calyx Bio, the cross-border pharmaceutical manufacturing platform. So welcome, Abhinav.
Thanks, Colin.
So Abhinav, I mean, first question, I mean, you lead the technology and telecoms team here. I mean, I can remember when I joined then CDC, 10 years ago, we didn't have a technology team, let alone a technology strategy. So, and suddenly technology is a key focus in our new 5-year strategy. So why suddenly do you have a team and technology is our focus?
Well, Colin, I think it's a recognition at BII that the whole society is a lot more tech-centric now than it used to be. And also that, you can't keep doing the same things again and again and expect different results. So digital is a whole new way of approaching some of the biggest challenges in society. I think through some of the investments made by BII a few years ago, they've seen how capital efficient it is in terms of creating that digital infrastructure. So because once the infrastructure is there, you can push a lot of content through it, whether it's education, whether it's things to do with governance, whether it's about creating financial inclusion or digital identity or improving governance. So it's very capital efficient. It's somewhat of a force multiplier, because once one sort of solution can affect many different parts of society. So that's what BII is saying now, that look, let's now try and address these big problems using technology and using this new way of seeing if we can solve for them.
So
and
before
Colin, I mean, I remember the days when we used to have to talk about how internet is helpful for development. So.
Well, before I ask the next question, let me just remind our audience to use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to ask questions as we continue this dialogue. But let's pick up that development impact question, because when people think of technology, they're thinking about kind of these broad system-led solutions that create often marginal improvements and marginal efficiency. Marginal not meaning that they can't be enormous in aggregate, but these kind of improvements in the way systems work. That seems often, that doesn't seem as clear in its development impact as starting a new farm of mangoes or cashew nuts in Malawi. So I mean, how do you continue to make sure that development impact is at the core of each one of these investments? Are there particular challenges you face in assessing the impact?
Yeah, I think, Colin, so we are impact-led, and every investment we do has to meet a certain bar on impact. And the team is also very committed to delivering impact. Now, the way to think of impact is slightly different depending on the sort of technology company you're looking at. And I refer back to what Nikunj was talking earlier about a digital stack, where at the base of the pyramid, you think of big digital infrastructure companies like the towers, data centers, and so on. For companies such as this, there is an established framework to say, look, how many people are you being able to access? There's a lot of theoretical work. I would mention Yort and Paulson's paper, which basically said, if you increase internet connectivity, you increase jobs. There are figures floating around on increase in GDP linked to increase in just availability of connectivity. So I think for the base of the pyramid, I think it's quite clear how we approach impact. I think when we start looking at companies that are either trying to deliver services in a tech-enabled manner, or are digitally native companies, but essentially replicating things that happen today without technology, but on a fully technology basis, that's where we have to develop new frameworks. And then, of course, there are disruptive companies, which are the tip of the pyramid. Now, for these sorts of tech-forward companies, so to say, we've worked quite hard at saying, look, what is the right way what is the right pathway to impact? How do we track it during the course of our investments? And I think now we have quite a robust framework to say, look, many of the impact pathways are similar to what you would see in normal companies, but just being enabled using technology, the scale, the intensity of some of that is much bigger, we think. And so we are creating different sorts of bars and metrics to try and measure that. And I would say that what we're seeing, these are very happy fishing grounds for us, because the companies that we're backing, they're all outsiders. I mean, they're coming in, they're disrupting the status quo, they're improving efficiencies. So in many ways, it's they stack up very well against any sort of impact metric. And what we're doing as BII is we are sharing some of this with many of the other funds that we happen to back, some of the other companies that are also interested in using these metrics and going and talking about them to their other investors. So there's a very active dialogue going on there.
Okay, great, Abhinav. Nikunj, I mean, DFIs have traditionally been providers of capital, but we've spoken at other of these events, and the recognition that the business environment is just as important as the provision of capital. I mean, are there unique problems that technology companies face in developing countries in business environments?
Absolutely. I mean, there are unique problems, but also unique opportunities at the same time. So to start with the latter, most of our underlying markets are characterized by demographics that are unique and positive. Depending on the country you're in, it's like, below the age of 30, you find 65 to 70% of the population, if not more, being there, and also importantly, most of them being digitally savvy. So the digital literacy amongst the people and the young folks in the emerging markets is unusually high. That is one. But the challenges companies face coming in is that they don't fundamentally understand the underlying markets coming in. I don't think that DFIs need to solve for that. These companies tend to be well funded and big enough to take care of themselves. What we should be looking at is to develop native local companies there that have local DNA, but also understand probably have a better understanding of how to deal with local problems. Markets that have less liquidity, people paying less on a transactional basis than they do in developed markets. Yet at the same time, there's a need for all of that. As Abhinav mentioned, you're developing the pipes here, and that's what BII and other DFIs have done initially. But now you need to push applications and solutions for deeper underlying problems through those pipes. And I don't believe that technology companies coming in from abroad are best suited for it. They need to be developed locally.
Right. And Abhinav, any thoughts on business environment?
Yeah. Look, I would classify it as there are some challenges that these companies face just because they happen to be young emerging businesses, right? So I mean, how do you recruit people? How do you get funding? How do you build the systems? And that's to be expected just because they're less mature. But then there is the whole technology aspect itself, right? So you run the risk of obsolescence on technology. You have to find ways to build that technology and have that engineering strength, which is sometimes challenging in especially some of our markets. And then many of these companies are disruptors, and with that comes a lot of risk because there are regulatory risks. Your business can just get shut down if let's say the central bank doesn't agree with what you're trying to do, and so those are pretty large risks, and we've seen that in the retail industry in India as well. And then there are some business model risks which are slightly unique, I would say, to these sets of companies. So sometimes it's about winner take all, and so you see a lot of companies bleeding cash, and it's almost like a race to the bottom. Sometimes it's about to Nikunj's point, I mean, large global behemoths can come in and then squeeze out local companies. So these sorts of business model issues are also there, somewhat unique for the tech companies that we see.
Great.
And
okay.
Just to follow up on Abhinav, sorry, it's like, this point where what we've seen happen in the last 2-3 years, specifically in developed markets, venture fueled companies that seem promising and where the strategy was being growth at all expenses. That doesn't work, specifically worked less in Africa, maybe more so in places like India, but that just doesn't work, generally speaking, in our underlying market. So one has to be a lot more focused, targeted, and cash savvy than counterparts on the venture and the technology industry in developed markets are.
Great. Okay, I'm going to now ask you both to kind of polish up your crystal balls and ask you questions about the future. Nikunj, a question to you is, in the next 10 years, what do you think the next big technology movement will be?
Well, I think there's going to be, it's a tough one, but there's going to be, if you look at emerging markets, I think there's going to be several trends that happen. One, I think that data analytics and the data-driven businesses will continue to grow. And I think artificial intelligence is going to be playing a bigger role, specifically in areas such as health and health management. We're already looking at opportunities in companies, for example, in the mental health space, where artificial intelligence is prevalent, and it's proven to be more efficient, more cost efficient, and allowing for a bigger scale. So that's really what you want to have. You want to provide, at the end of the day, use technology to provide cheaper, but also better quality of services and provision of goods towards end users. The other trend I would see happening is the continued electrification of underlying markets. And so I think we are looking at, not electrifying grid the traditional way, because as Abhinav said, doing more of the same hasn't really happened in markets which sees an electrification of the grid maybe of around 20 or 25%. So there need to be other solutions for that, and looking at providing local distributed solutions that build on what we've seen so far happen in CNI and happening on the microgrid side. But the whole part of climate meeting developing markets is going to become more and more important in our underlying businesses. The other interesting thing you find in urbanization is the electrification of vehicles, to start off with buses and trucks, small commercial vehicles, eventually looking in personal passenger vehicles. I see that happen as you find, cities such as Lagos and Cairo grow bigger and bigger, and there being more emphasis on climate control. You'll see policymakers come through with more pressure on developing electric solutions in underlying markets.
Great. And Abhinav, same question, but one slight variation, which is, where do you see the most impactful technology changes emerging over the next 10 years?
Yeah, that's an easy question, Colin. Look, I would say and there are many underlying things, but for me, the single biggest challenge that will emerge from these, or the change that we'll see, is around this whole concept of automation. And when I say automation, this is built on really fast computing or quantum computing. It's built on application of AI in ways which we're seeing now, but it's only going to get better and better. You will see software do their own coding, so you won't need coders. I would imagine a lot of financial services firms will just not need people for processing. I think the delivery economy will get fully automated. I think you will have a sort of, and this has huge implications on jobs, on how we're looking at some of these technology trends, and has big implications back on policymakers to say, look, what sort of solutions should we aim to drive towards as a society? And doesn't mean that you stop automation, you stop technology, but it does mean that there's quite a bit of thinking to be done on how we're educating our children, how we're really sort of thinking of livelihood in the future. And Colin, I guess your question is a bit more nuanced, because you're saying, look, how should governments think of just sustaining this technology trend which is happening? And here, there is a very interesting paradigm. It's come from China, which is largely saying, look, if you've got three things, if you've got cheap bandwidth, and if you've got a cheap smartphone, and if you've got an efficient way for payments, then you just sit back and the whole technology revolution will happen. And I think we're seeing some of that at least in India, it's beginning to happen. So smartphones at roughly $100, very cheap bandwidth, and publicly owned digital payments infrastructure, which enables quite efficient payments. And that just enables e-commerce. It enables all sorts of B2B applications to work. And so I think other governments should essentially focus on these three things. How do you make bandwidth cheaper? How do you make sure there are enough devices in the market? And maybe that involves manufacturing, maybe it involves some sort of subsidy, but I think that's quite important. And then really working on making payments efficient. So whether that's through Sandbox, which allows you to test out a few solutions, whether it's just bringing in some sorts of mobile money, whether it's actually using solutions already there in China or India. And I would say that's what, as a policy, the government should look at.
So could I just come in? Come in there?
Especially on this government side. Yeah.
Yeah. So I do agree full-heartedly with what Abhinav says. I would add to that look, it's not all sunshine, right? So digitization, it's not going to be win-win. And as Abhinav was mentioning, it may cut out jobs because of change of business models. You're taking out intermediary brokers in particular business models. So that requires reskilling or rejobbing of people. And so there are programs that government would need to help in setting that up. Similarly, if you introduce digital tools into, let's say, the schooling system, it doesn't mean that it's going to be sunshine. Because if teachers are not familiar with how to use the digital tools, nor familiar with how to measure for desired outcomes amongst the students, then that will go to waste. So there's a bit of reskilling that needs to happen on that. And then there's general, and the government will have to come up with programs as they have in other markets, in several markets. And then there's a general focus that needs to be happening on developing digital skills in universities and colleges, and making sure that people who graduate with engineering computer science degree don't come out with, which has been the case much in developing markets, come out with, you graduate smart students, but they happen to have the wrong skills. And last I would say is that while it's not a small effort, but to create that whole enabling environment at the early stage to, even allow for cultural change to that starts probably at schools and at colleges to show that entrepreneurship is a viable and it's an okay career to choose for, as opposed to looking at the traditional prestigious careers. That's an important part. And also with that, try to develop those early stage incubators that, in which people can try out their ideas and try out their technologies, and knowing that many of them can fail, but that they can come back and try out new technology. So create that serial approach towards trying out businesses. So creating that whole entrepreneurial founder-led mentality in underlying markets is going to be critical towards the growth we're envisaging.
Great, thanks. So in thanks for your appearing on our Insight event, I am going to award each of you a hypothetical $100 million. And my last question is going to be to each of you. How would you spend your $100 million in order to best catalyze digital transformation in a low or middle income country? And I'll ask Abhinav first.
Right. And Colin, the logic of just taking it in a helicopter and throwing it around is not, that's out. So look, I would, it's actually a very important question, Colin, because it plays to how do we think of portfolio construction. And look, so for instance, recently there was a very interesting paper done by Suryan Bhattacharya, which is about impact of internet on the poor in Kenya. That's the name of the title of the paper. And it basically says that just by increasing connectivity, there was zero impact on anything else. So they took a bunch of people and they gave them free bandwidth and access to internet. And I think what the paper seems to suggest is that you do need a bit of a overall ecosystem development to create the right sort of impact, the sort of impact that can come from technology interventions. And so when I think of a portfolio construction using that 100 million, for me, it is about creating that overall ecosystem. So we'll start off with some investments in bandwidth, and this would include data centers, because you need data centers on the edge to make a lot of these applications accessible to people. So roughly, I would say half of the 100 million, so 50 million will go into connectivity plays. So whether it's fiber to home, fiber to enterprise, data centers. Then I would put about roughly 30 million into companies that do two things. So either companies which are improving efficiencies for SMEs, reducing friction in the way they engage with larger customers or larger suppliers, and have become part of larger platforms, or companies that are creating the new tech jobs in terms of, and I'm thinking blue collar jobs, so in a way, so delivery, ride sharing, these sorts of companies. And then I would put about 10 million into disruptive companies which are trying for these moonshots. So can we detect cancer using a phone, and can I actually improve, or can I do can I improve life to 150 years with a certain level of monitoring? That still leaves me with 10 million, which we would put into those companies that are doing better, because I think in a way you also want to make it commercially sustainable. So that's how I would spend my 100, Colin.
Okay, so Nikunj, Abhinav has built a pension portfolio. What's your approach with your 100 million?
Yeah, the usual way and the right way is to go about it by portfolio construct, like Abhinav has done. I'll interpret your question different. I'll take a one shot at a play, and I'd say effectively anything in the financial inclusion space. Why? Because it allows for transactions to happen and for people to grow the business, underlying business as such. So imagine to invest into a fintech, and they're around a fintech play that on lends to smallholder farmers out in Africa, and in turn they can go out and use that working capital to buy more inputs and therefore increase their yield, and then come back and then take on more loans, and so create that flywheel effect. So using financial inclusion as an enabler towards underlying sectors that allow for better efficiencies of the supply chain, better efficiencies of critical areas such as ag. And beyond that, even at the consumer level, is going to be important. And so anything that uses the flywheel effect, where people are able to enhance income as a result of the fact that they get access to liquidity and funding that they elsewise wouldn't have done, and obviously couple that with great credit scoring mechanisms, which is one of the key challenges in our underlying market, will allow for growing business, but also will allow for reach. And there are tons of examples in underlying markets. So, for example, bKash in Bangladesh is an early play on consumers, where I believe it's now the largest bank effectively that has taken over, and it's got 40-50% of the population, if I'm not mistaken. And so there are other such examples in markets in which it's starting, where there are lots of opportunities. Pakistan, for example, is a huge market, 200 million people. It's come to the digital play at a relatively late stage because 4G got introduced at a relatively late stage. But there's still 200 million people who are looking to get online. And so there's a huge opportunity to do work there on the fintech side, amongst others.
Okay, maybe we'll be able to come back in 10 years and someone will do the work and decide, which approach was more impactful. But for now, let's take some of the questions from the audience. The first one, Nikunj, would be to you. I mean, you spoke about the difficulties of recreating Silicon Valley in an emerging economy, but then you spoke somewhat favorably about incubators. So can we talk a little bit about incubators and what you think the role incubators should play, especially in developing economies around technology?
I think that's a good point, and it's what I said is not necessarily mutually exclusive. I think incubators need to be set up and they have been set up in many markets. North Africa has several incubators, Flat Six Lab being one of them, for example, and several other incubators. Nairobi has probably over 100 incubators out there, but each have their own business model. Some are incubating by providing advisory consulting services. Others incubate by providing microfinancing in addition to this consultancy services. On a one-off basis. Others incubate by using the traditional Y Combinator model, where they take on huge cohorts and seek to nurture them and provide them some semblance of financing and take on equity stake in those companies and hope for the best that these cohorts come out and grow on their own right. In our markets, in developing markets, as there's a lack of ecosystem, as there's a lack of understanding on what makes companies grow to success, there's a lot more hand-holding needed. And so the key part is that the mentorship model needs to be introduced and needs to be much more emphasized in these markets. And the key challenge is that there are not a lot of mentors around because the market is nascent, it's new. There are not a lot of serial entrepreneurs around who typically are the best mentors because they have learned from their earlier mistakes and therefore could make sure that the next cohort won't make those mistakes. So it's a matter of developing, the next generation mentors as well as the next generation investors who come into those incubators which is a different approach from what Silicon Valley and Y Combinator has. But if one is successful in that, it avoids the brain drainage of good quality companies moving from Africa or from South Asia to Silicon Valley and continue to set up shop there.
Okay, great. Abhinav, before I ask you a question, anything you want to add on that one?
I think Nikunj pretty much covered all of it. It's yeah.
Okay. So I mean, a big part of BII's approach on development impact is this notion of inclusivity. And there's been a lot spoken of the digital divide. The digital divide not only between developed and developing countries, but also in developing countries between those who can afford a lot of technology and those who can't. So how do you ensure that technology investments are inclusive?
So, Colin, should I attempt an answer on this one?
Please, give it a whirl.
So, look, I think first, I think all of us need to appreciate that the usage of technology is really desired by everybody. So this is not something you're imposing on people. So the poorest person in our markets, if they have access to phones, they start using technology. And the first things they do is usually around WhatsApp and Facebook and so on. Then they get into sets of modes of payments. So people want to use it. Now, for us to find a metric on making things inclusive, it's a lot about saying who's using it, and also who eventually will use it over a period of time. Because often you have to start with a certain different population and then make sure it goes to the broader set of people. We like models that are very easy to scale up, because that again usually means that it starts getting inclusive quite quickly. We avoid things which are, not inclusive almost by definition. So if you are into asset management, for the rich, we don't do that. And often, if it's a company which is solving for B2B SaaS sort of business models for the US, but based out of our markets, again, it's not something that we find super inclusive. But otherwise, we find a lot of different business models that can be seen as being inclusive by asking the question, who is it serving, or who will it eventually serve?
Okay, and Nikunj, any thoughts before I pose another question to you?
No, the only point I'd add to it is that inclusive models very much need to look at, insofar technology has been borrowed or originated from the West, is to look at local language solutions, which is absolutely critical in all our markets. And the more you focus on that, the more you look at local inclusion.
Okay, so there's one question about what barrier does IP rights create in developing countries? And I think this question goes to the point of, if IP is being developed in developed countries and then is being protected in developed countries, is this an inhibition to technology growth in developing countries? Nikunj, I think it's Nikunj first.
Coming from a lawyer, Colin, so I can see that you had an affinity towards that question. So, look, I think IP rights is it's a hairy point, this point always came up traditionally in places like China, where effectively in the initial years you'd find technology being deployed from other parts of the world, and but what you've seen happen lately is that, lately being the last 10, 15 years, is that people are developing their own local solutions and local technology. And that is not by doing a reverse engineer of the technologies come in, but really by starting from scratch with a much more adaptable model in the local market. So taking the basics, Uber started in in the US, and you're finding tons of rideshare applications out in underlying markets in India. You have Ola, you have Bolt, and several other players in sub-Saharan Africa. Is that an infringement of IP? I don't think so. People have developed their own solutions out there, and it's not, IP is probably less of an issue there, and it's really about developing business models that are germane and applicable towards local markets. I think IP becomes an important factor, a more important factor. So I don't want to poo-poo it, but it's a more important factor when you're looking at deep tech applications. And so, for example, if there's AI that's been developed in Europe or in US, and that particular piece of AI gets used and replicated in underlying markets in Africa, then it becomes hairier. And I think people are more concerned at that level rather than looking at business model transformation.
Abhinav.
Yeah, Colin, I think Nikunj is exactly right when he says that there are the disruptive businesses where the IP is quite critical, but there are enough businesses that are more in the nature of using technology to reduce friction or just increase efficiency, where it's not really about IP. So it's a lot about execution. It's about product market fit and customizing and so on. And so ride the Uber replicants in our markets, or people who are building e-commerce players. I mean, that's not at all about now about IP. I think in some of our markets, there has been a public creation of some of the digital infrastructure and payments infrastructure. I think that's been very helpful in easing some of these IP linked issues. There do remain big challenges. I would say deep tech is one. I'd say one area which will be quite problematic is around this whole mobility and especially around the battery and the charging, technology, because I think that has big impact for our markets. But I think all the development is happening in other countries. So there is sufficient space, Colin, without an IPR challenge, but there are areas where it is there, and it's hard to see how we work our way around.
Okay. And Abhinav, a lot has been talked about climate tech. And I mean, is climate tech an opportunity that is really in the developed markets, or is it credible to believe that climate tech is an opportunity also in developing markets?
So, Colin, actually, it's a lot of the innovations are happening in the developed markets, but developing markets are, in a way, they need these solutions right now. Whether it's around, so a lot of the climate change effects are affecting these markets. So, and we see quite a few innovative models coming through. So, the way to use renewables, whether for power generation or for mobility, I think some of what you're seeing in India and now increasingly in Egypt and so on is quite advanced. So you are seeing some of that. We're not seeing as much around use of materials which are innovative, or use of the whole recycling economy or circular economy is still nascent. But you can see green shoots of efforts there. I mean, I think one of our portfolio companies is developing one of the fastest ways to charge, two-wheel form factors and for mobility. And that's actually more advanced than what we've seen against anything we've seen in the US. So there are some innovations. There is absolutely lots of need for it. I think on the renewable side, lots of progress in our markets. But yeah, that's where we are. And
Nikunj, I saw you nodding, so can I introduce you to this as well?
Yeah, sorry, it's like very near and dear to me. So having invested in climate space for 15 plus years, and gone through usual cycles, I think there is what Abhinav says is absolutely the case. There is in some markets don't have a choice but have to go down the road in which they need to be climate efficient. And we would traditionally look at it as like using solutions such as solar panels, wind energy, alternative forms of renewable energy, which absolutely is critical. But now you're dealing with a scenario where a digitized world, digitized place, can actually provide more solutions. So some of them are mobility driven, as Abhinav says, but even in the ag space, where you're able to better manage for waste, better manage for inputs, better manage for yield of your crops, taking a data-driven input, using data that is either generated by satellite images or by drones, or a combination thereof, is that one, it's absolutely key. Two, it's like, it makes financial sense. But three, importantly, it has a lot of climate positive impacts. People don't realize it because we don't measure it, but it's got a huge amount of impacts on climate that is positive. So I'd say that climate tech is absolutely for developing markets, the bang for the buck in terms of reach, not just in terms of financial returns, but in terms of non-financial impact is much bigger and much more effective in developing markets. So it should absolutely be an area one should focus on.
Thanks. And last question to both of you. I mean, this is much in the headlines have been government-backed digital currencies. And I guess the question is, I mean, this is almost a macro development impact, but for developing countries which have struggled with currency issues and FX issues and so forth, I mean, is this an area that you think might be fruitful for development impact?
Happy to start. Risking off to start on this, but look, the whole Web3 economy will happen. It's a matter of time. Now, it will happen with those of us old enough knowing what happened in the 90s and early 2000s with Internet 1.0 and 2.0. There was huge hype. Then there was a big crash, and people turned off and thought that the Internet was essentially a hoax. But here we are, and effectively much of our lives have been dependent by the regular internet. Web3 and everything that comes with it, so the decentralized approach, the fact that there's more focus on creators, I think it's going to be an important part of our lives that we're going to be dealing with in the next decade. I personally don't believe in government-backed centralized plays on digital. I think notionally on the margins they would provide more safety, more security, and so forth. But from a longer-term perspective, I believe that eventually things will be more operating on a distributed level, where you won't find one central bank regulating the cryptocurrency industry, but you'll find it being regulated by multiple entities. And so those who are looking to come out with e-currencies out there may be an interesting step in the right direction. Longer term, I believe we're going to get more involved in a distributed world rather than a centralized world.
Abhinav.
Yeah. I think, Colin, what I would add is, look, any currency is it's about trust, right? And I think I don't know when that tipping point is, but maybe it is within these 10 years. I think there are many trends which are sort of supporting this this sort of currency. The fact that your reserve currency as dollars is not as safe as people imagined, I'm sure will give it a bit of an impetus. I mean, China is the biggest holder of dollars as a reserve currency. I think government would be smart to try and get in early on this, because this trend will happen whether they participate or not. I mean, it's hard to see how it will evolve, but this is not going to die very quickly, and it's a trend to watch for. And we've seen a lot of people leapfrog solutions. So mobile phones allowed you to leapfrog whatever landlines, and we've seen payment systems do that. I think this will do it as well for some of our countries where the currencies are very shaky.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We've come to the end of our time here, and really all I can do is join with all of our, listeners in a virtual round of applause for our, two speakers today, Nikunj and Abhinav. Thank you very much. And thank you to all of our listeners. I hope that you will join us for the next Inside event. And until then, have a good day.
Thank you.